I'm Professor Kevin Jones, Executive Dean, Science and Engineering here at the University of Plymouth, and I have the great honor to welcome you to an inaugural professorial lecture for Professor Daniel Conley. Now, many of you already know this, but in case you don't, a professorial appointment is the highest academic appointment one can achieve. It means you've been recognized as an international expert, having made significant contributions to your field of study. One of the things we expect of professors is that they profess, which basically means explain their knowledge to an audience. And for the inaugural lecture, that's an audience that's about as difficult as it can get. Members of the public, friends, family, colleagues, experts. So I'm sure you'll have an interesting experience tonight going through this lecture. But before you get to the interesting stuff, I'm afraid there is some housekeeping we have to go through. This is being done as a blended event, which means those of you who can see each other are here in person. Those of you who are online can't see everyone in the room, but are still an important part of this event. So a few rules to try and make a blended event work well for everyone. So first of all, for online attendees, you will be kept on mute with your video off through the lecture. If you find there are any technical issues of trying to make this work, please send an email to events@plymouth.ac.uk and we'll try and sort things out. If you wish to ask a question, please visit slido.com and enter the code #562858. Type your question, and those questions will be looked at the end of the lecture. Not all questions will be answered if there are lots of them. If not, Daniel will be allowed to give very long answers to the questions he's been given. We will make sure that the questions are taken from Slido, so it's the same experience for those who are here or those who are online. So if you're burning to answer a question, you're sitting in the room, get out your smartphone, log into Slido, and let's see if we can work it that way. The chat function for those of you online is available to facilitate discussion, but it will not be used for the Q&A session. That Q&A session will be on Slido. For those of you who are here, we can't turn your cameras off and we can't mute you. But please do try to keep your mobile phones set to silent and try and obviously avoid those kind of interruptions because we all know how annoying they are. You may find that your ringtone is the best thing you've ever heard, but the second time somebody else hears it, it doesn't usually sound that way. The other thing important for people who are here in person, if there is an emergency, obviously we will need you to leave the theatre. There are exits marked front and back of the room. In the case of an emergency, exit by the most convenient exit. And the fire rendezvous point for this is if you go out the west side of the building, congregate basically over there. If you go out to the east side of the building, congregate over there. It'll become obvious if you do need to leave. If you are an in-person attendee and you want to ask a question, same mechanism, slido.com and the same code. And again, at the end of the session, when we get to Q&A, those questions will be looked at. For those of you who haven't used Slido before, you can also upvote questions to make sure that the one you're most interested in is going to be the one that's asked and answered. Okay. Now that the housekeeping is over the way, we can get to the important parts of the evening. So let me pass you over to Professor Maslink, who will introduce your speaker for this evening.
Thank you, Kevin. My name is Gert Maslink. I'm a professor in coastal geomorphology at Plymouth University, and I've worked with Daniel for 15 years. Yeah. So Daniel Charles Conley was born in Bogota in Colombia, and when he was 5, his family moved to Madison in the state of Wisconsin in the US. Wisconsin is a landlocked state, but it does share its border with Lake Superior and Lake Michigan. I like to think that young Daniel developed his interest in oceanography during seaside holidays and day trips to the Great Lakes. After all, these lakes are huge, and they must resemble an ocean to a child. Daniel was an undergraduate at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, also known as MIT, which consistently ranks as one of the top 5 universities in the world. Daniel double majored in ocean engineering and geophysics and graduated in 1980. After his graduation, Daniel worked for several years as a wireline engineer for Schlumberger Offshore and as a seismic analyst at the US Geological Survey in California. He then took a few years out and he traveled extensively, including being part of the first group of foreign tourists to China. In 1986, Daniel started his PhD research at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University in California. This is another world-class institution, and I think we see a pattern emerging here. His supervisor was Doug Inman, who was at the time the world leader in coastal sediment transport processes, and a bit of a personal hero of mine. The topic of Daniel's PhD was ventilated oscillatory boundary layers. Well, this is quite a mouthful of jargon, but what it means is that he was doing fundamental research into sediment transport processes under ocean waves, the topic of today's inaugural. Now, to be more specific, Daniel was studying how water flowing into and out of the seabed during the passage of waves changes the sediment transport potential of wave-driven currents. This groundbreaking research is still widely cited and used by oceanographers and engineers in coastal sediment transport modeling. Daniel obtained his PhD in oceanography in 1993. After he finished his PhD, Daniel took up the position of assistant professor at the Marine Science Research Center, State University of New York, and he stayed there until 1999. Here, he continued investigating sediment transport processes, but he also broadened his research interests into barrier islands, tidal inlets, and estuaries. At the end of his tenure, he participated in one of the largest beach experiments in the world on the east coast of the US, the so-called Sandy Duck experiment, and he will talk about this in his lecture. Daniel then made a major change and moved to Italy and took up a position as a research scientist at the NATO Undersea Research Center in La Spezia on the Mediterranean Sea between Genoa and Pisa. Some of his work there was top secret, but he also continued working on nearshore sediment transport. He was also a pioneer in the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, colloquially known as drones, to study surfs on waves and currents. I'm still not sure what compelled him to swap the sun-stroked shores and the culinary delights of La Spezia with the wet and windy coast and pasties of Plymouth, but he did. In 2007, he took up the position of a reader in coastal dynamics modeling at the University of Plymouth. Who was to know that 15 years after his arrival, this university would be ranked as the world's best for marine research? Daniel was appointed as part of a special initiative to develop expertise in marine renewable energy, and he committed himself to researching the impacts of tidal turbines and wave energy converters on the marine and coastal environment. He also joined the Coastal Processes Research Group, referred to as CPRG, and maintained a healthy interest in nearshore sediment transport processes. Over the past 15 years, he has been involved with numerous NERC and EPSRC funded projects together with other CPRG colleagues, always trying to find out more about how sediments move on beaches. Daniel has been a key member of our research group. His specific expertise as a numerical modeler and his strong background in physics has been particularly valuable. He remains, however, fundamentally a field person and has been involved with many field campaigns where his advanced age has been more than compensated by his towering height and strength and his technical know-how. Daniel is often unapologetically critical as well as honest, and his opinion is invariably valued. One of Daniel's key attributes is that he's always prepared to step up. Despite being actively involved with numerous research and consultancy projects and being the school union's representative, he volunteered last year to become the associate head of school for the marine science subject area. In short, Daniel is an exemplary university citizen and a fantastic colleague and a friend. Daniel has made major contributions to the field of nearshore sediment transport and to the coastal research in Plymouth, and I have no doubt he will continue to do so. He's very worthy of his chair in nearshore processes, and I look very much forward to his inaugural presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Had. That was nice to hear. I welcome you all, both those of you in front of me and those of you behind the camera. It's great to be here. I do know that we have an international audience, so I question how many know. We got connection issues on the. There we go. Thank you. Not everybody's aware that the inaugural lecture tradition, and so I just quickly point out that it is something I think is quite broad, widely spread among Commonwealth nations, not so much so in other places in the world, but it is a chance to celebrate promotion to professor, as Kevin told us, and to share some of the work that the promotee has done in the course of their career. It is always a public event, but there are different styles in doing it, and sometimes the lectures are not particularly targeted towards the public. My goal here is to talk about the work I have done, but to present it in a fashion that the public sees it. I think you might find that it's a bit of a fire hose. My goal is that you will get a good description of the forest by the time we're done. And whether you know exactly what the individual trees look like, you still know the shape of the forest. If some of you have some more in-depth questions about the trees, please feel free at the end and we can go into some of the details. So what is coastal sediment transport? What is sediment transport? Sediment transport is the study of the movement of granular material. That generally involves understanding, in-depth understanding of the physics and movements of the fluids that transport those materials, as well as the processes that lead to the mobilization, the movement from where they are at rest, and the deposition, returning to the bed. It's a field which actually has application among a wide range of disciplines, from geology to chemical engineering, and a lot of things in between there. To me, I'm interested in it because it's what builds and erodes beaches. And so understanding coastal sediment transport allows you to understand and maybe predict and prevent, as you want to, those processes. It actually, as we've heard earlier, is kind of been one of the major focuses of my career in the 30 years since I came. Now, usually, I said it is a tradition associated with the promotion to professor, and I know it's been a really long time coming. I'm talking about the lecture, not necessarily the promotion, but in fact, something came around the world that prevented me from doing this in person, and I really did want to have a live audience in front of me when I did it. So we have postponed, and it's 2 years down the line. I'm glad to be able to be the first person to have a return to a professorial lecture, but I'm also really appreciative of the events team, which has allowed us to have this blended approach. And there's a lot of people behind that camera I know that are joining us, so I want to thank you all for coming. I know that sediment transport doesn't necessarily inspire a lot of interest in probably the public in general. I have a good idea exactly what kind of emotions it might emote in people. It's definitely not something I put on my dating website. But I was actually caught up short recently, not recently, about a decade ago, when I was watching the television series Friends with my family. Now, I don't know how many of you actually know this series, but it's about a group of young people living in New York and the adventures they have. And one of the characters in there, Ross, is publicized as a paleontologist. And the writers use him being a paleontologist as a sign of how boring he is. However, in one particular episode, they decided they needed to make him even more boring. And so I thought I would share this sequence with you to start off our talk. For those of you who have any doubts, sediment flow rate is a synonym for sediment transport. And with that, let's just see what Ross has to say. Okay, all right. So I hope that's not what you were looking forward to when you came here. I do have one agreement with Ross. I'm not going to put any pictures of undressed women in my lecture, but I am putting this picture on the board. Quick show of hands. Who knows who this is? Yeah, that's exactly what I thought. Probably behind the camera, everybody's held their hands up too. It is indeed Albert Einstein. And I think you will all agree with me that he's widely recognized as probably one of the seminal thinkers of the 20th century. What's not widely known is that Albert Einstein started off looking at sediment transport. In fact, particularly he looked at the problem of hindered settling, which is the issue of how grains in a fluid settle when they're alone and when there are a bunch of other grains around them. It's a notoriously difficult problem. Fortunately, Albert proved his wisdom by deciding to give up the study of sediment transport and went on to easier topics like the space-time continuum. I think it's important. This equation that's behind my head is probably almost as famous as the man himself. And I think its simplicity and its clarity might speak a lot to why his work and himself are so widely known. Now, just out of curiosity, anybody in the room know who that is? And the answer is no. Nobody in the audience knows who it is. This is, in fact, Heinz Albert Einstein, the son of Albert Einstein. Heinz Albert did like the offspring of many famous people and chose the one thing that his parents failed at in order to drive his career. And so he dedicated his life to the study of sediment transport, fluvial sediment transport of sediment in rivers. In the field, he was a fairly successful scientist. He published many of the well-known sediment transport relations, and also trained many of the successful sediment transport experts that followed him. He retired from the University of Berkeley, where he ran the hydraulics laboratory, largely unknown to the masses. And if we look at, say, one of his famous equations, I think we get a picture of the difference between space-time continuum and sediment transport. Possibly also why he was not so famous. Okay, so why did I choose to study coastal sediment transport? Well, this is a picture of the kind of rivers that Heinz Albert studied. And it's actually a fairly complex situation here. First of all, you've got the river is changing direction. So you have all the processes associated with that fluid making a corner and changing direction. You have the injection of water bubbles into the fluid that's affecting the way it behaves. We've got a range of sediments. We've probably got a nice big patch of sand sitting under this pool here, and off there we've got different kinds of gravels and boulders and so on, which makes trying to figure out the sediment transport that's occurring there a complex problem. However, if you consider that picture, I've got them. There we go. With this picture, perhaps you get the idea that all the complexity we talked about in the first slide is there, plus more. If I had quizzed you all on the first picture, where the picture of the river, and I asked you, despite that complexity, what direction is the sediment moving? I'll bet the most of you would have responded downstream. In this picture, even a trained coastal engineer can't sit in the front row and look at that picture and tell you which way sediment's going. It's largely unspecified. So to begin to understand a bit why this might be, I have to introduce a bit of wave physics here, and basically talk about what water does under a wave. So waves don't typically lead to a net displacement in water. They tend to circulate what we call oscillatory flow. Basically, the water is moving back and forth. The image I have at the bottom is designed to show something else, but I can use it for a very useful purpose of trying to explain what's so complex about sediment transport in coastal waters. If you look at those red dots at the bottom, and you see that those red dots between each wave are going backwards and forwards. And then in the middle of but the actual progress they make is a very tiny space. So sediment transport under waves, to understand sediment transport under waves, you have to be able to predict very large excursions of sediment transport accurately enough that you can determine that small difference between those two sediment pathways. And that's the challenge, and it's the reason that we have a very hard time being able to replicate this kind of processes. So I'll bring that into a discussion. I'll bring that into a discussion of why our beaches are important. They not important, but persistent. They exist across over 30% of the world's coastlines. They're present in all continents. They have a far outsized representation in human interaction with the coasts. Often, many people, that's the only part of the coast they ever see. And beaches have existed throughout geologic time. So where are those beaches? They're sitting, of course, basically on the edge of the continental slope. They're a loose pile of sediment perched up on the continental slope, and they're subjected to waves, which to the first order basically pick the sediment up and drop it back down. So if you were picking up and dropping down something on the edge of a mountain slope, what do you think is going to happen to it? You think that actually, potentially pretty fast, it's going to drop down into the ocean. Yet beaches persist and stay for a long time, and they don't tend to disappear. And that's sort of the mystery that we're trying to figure out in the course of this kind of research. Some aspects about cross-shore sediment transport, which is not just sediment transport on the waves, but it's particularly that offshore, going from the beaches to the deep and back again, is that's the part of sediment transport that is least like fluvial transport. So a lot of the knowledge we've developed working on rivers doesn't directly apply in that context. It is the component of sediment transport in the near shore that leads to the most dramatic changes in your beaches. When you show up at the beach a day after the big storm and tens of meters of beach seem to have disappeared, it's the cross-shore sediment transport that's responsible. This phenomena is poorly represented in existing numerical models and continues to be a challenge. And so what I've spent a lot of my career trying to figure out is what are the differences? What is it about that sediment transport under the crest of the wave heading towards the beach that's different to the sediment transport under the trough of the wave heading away from the beach that seems to lead to this continuous maintenance of the beach against gravity? And the first chance I had to look at this issue was when I showed up at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography to begin my PhD. And I had the good fortune to be immediately dumped into an experiment there that was going on at Scripps, where we were trying to identify turbulent bursting, which was a hot scientific topic at that time. We were trying to identify it in the boundary layer of waves in the field conditions. And this was the research rig that we had set up. Of particular interest to this is, well, the hot film, which was the sensitive instrument we were using to try and measure flows near the bed. But more importantly, it was that video camera that we used to monitor that was designed to monitor our instruments, but ended up being incredibly useful for what we got out of the project. This cloudy picture down here, some of you, if we've got a good quality, you're able to see those little plumes of sediment, and that is actually a phase of sediment response on the beach we identified and called pluming. In fact, we came up with this nice typical picture of what happens to sediments under a wave half cycle, from when they start at zero velocity and go higher and then drop back down, is that initially the grains are at rest. They start this sort of rolling, streaking transport on the ground. They tend to, as turbulence builds up, we tend to get a thicker layer. And then if the waves are big enough, we tend to get this pluming that sends the sediment up into the water column, and then it falls out. The other thing we saw, we knew that this didn't happen all the time. If the waves were weaker, we might go only partly through this sequence, and that in fact is the case. But what we found is on incredibly strong waves, the full sequence didn't develop either, and it stopped at the roiling stage. And instead, we got this very energetic but relatively thin layer of really concentrated sediment moving along the bed. And the other thing we observed is this limitation of the response never occurred under the trough of a wave. It never occurred under the offshore flow. It was only occurring under the onshore flow. So I took that observation and tried to use it, bring it into my dissertation, and come up with a hypothesis what might cause it. And there were several publications at the time that were talking about what would happen with a wave flowing over a permeable bed, like a sand bed on the beach. And the mathematicians told us that if you, under the crest, this flow would lead to a secondary circulation through the bed, where under the crest of the wave, water would be forced into the bed, and under the trough of the wave, water would be forced out of the bed. Now, that was fairly commonly known, and people sort of left it at that point, but we were able to combine that with another piece of fluid dynamics knowledge, that small flows across a boundary had a dramatic effect on the bed stress under that flow. The bed stress is the friction, basically, of the fluid of the bed, and that's what moves, that's what initiates and moves sediment. So if we were having big effects on the bed stress, we could be affecting the sediment response. And the way that effect works is if the flow's into the bed, it increases the bed stress. So it increases the ability to transport sediment. And if the water's moving out of the bed, it decreases the bed stress and thereby reduces its potential for moving sediment. To test this theory out, we went into the laboratory. We used one of those facilities I had access to at Scripps, the oscillatory flow tunnel. This is a rather large structure. You can see part of it in this image here, which is able to drive an oscillatory flow, so reproducing the flow under a wave in the laboratory. And we added a secondary part to it where we put a permeable bed into the flow facility. And then we put in a secondary plumbing system that was also able to drive this vertical flow out of the bed. So we could reproduce that model of boundary ventilation and measure very accurately what was the impact on the flow. Now, I won't go too much into the detail, but the effect was pretty dramatic. These are contour plots as a function of wave phase and height above the bed, and they basically show us the turbulence that exists. In the top image, we're seeing the turbulence without the ventilation, and the bottom, we're seeing the turbulence with ventilation. And we see just this dramatic buildup in the amount of turbulence that's present under the crest of the wave, the sediment driving potential, and a really reduced signal under the trough. So we confirmed that this effect would work the way we think it was. We were able to come up with algorithms that told how strong the effect would be. And with that came the understanding that the kind of ventilations we would see in a natural sand bed in the surf zone was probably too small to actually have much an effect. But we did predict at the time that there were other situations and cases where it would be important. For example, the swash zone is a good place where that might happen, and also among coarser sediments. That's about the time, I'm getting the wrong. That's about the time I moved to Stony Brook. There was also a little bit, minor bit of controversy about our hypothesis, because some of you might have noticed this, that actually under the trough of the wave, we have flow coming out of the bed. Now, if you have this idea of a jet coming out of the bed, you're gonna think, well, that's just picking up sediment and putting it into the water column, and that's gonna happen under the trough of the wave, and then we've got this jet of water flowing into the bed, and that's going to stick the sediment to the ground, and that's going to reduce the sediment transport. I knew all along that the quantity of flows we were talking about would have would not work that way, and its impact on the boundary layer was the important part. But we tried to go into the field and make some measurements. That would look at that. John Griffin, a master's student at Stony Brook, and myself went and did a very simple field experiment where we put a platform into the swash zone that was able to measure the shear stress. And we were able to show pretty convincingly that the shear stresses under the swash, even for under the uprush, for equivalent conditions, was significantly higher than the shear stress under the backwash. However, I will be eternally grateful for some other scientists who also studied this. So I'm sure you all know, but the way science works is not because one person makes a discovery. It's when the second person confirms what they've found. So my colleagues, Ian Turner and Professor Ed Maslink, went out and did an experiment in Australia where they measured similar things, but they were also able to measure the morphological response of the beach, and they were able to measure the pressure gradients in the bed. So they were directly measuring this boundary ventilation in there, and they were able to quantify the effects of that. And instead of showing you some of their results, I'm just going to repeat my favorite quote from their paper. Swash infiltration exfiltration enhances the net upslope transport of sediment across the saturated beach face. And I think that not only was it a good confirmation of our theory, but it also eliminated that question there of which was the bigger effect. So about the same time, I had another amazing opportunity to go attend the Sandy Duck experiment, which was, as Herod said, a large field experiment at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers research facility on Duck, North Carolina, on the Outer Banks. The experiment I was joined part of involved installing these new instruments, VIMA FOBs. VIMA were a form of current meter, and FOBs are an instrument that's designed to measure sediment concentration. Both of these had multiple independent estimates, so we could begin to get an idea of the profile of the velocities, but also the sediment concentration. Now, the product of fluid velocity and sediment concentration is sediment transport. So it was almost a perfect experiment for measuring sediment transport. This is one of the pieces of results we got out of that study. There's a lot of information in here. I want you to focus only on one part, which is the net transport, okay? So we have a series of bars. They talk about different components of transport, but basically the red bar is the net transport, where sediment's gonna go in that location. And what your eyes may not immediately pick out is the net sediment transport through the water column looks something like that. So it's not a case of which way is the sediment going, is it offshore or onshore? It's going both directions, depending where you are in the water column. And in fact, the total sediment transport, the integral of this total component, is very sensitive on kind of where this transition occurs. If you move that transition a little bit further up, we have onshore transport. If we move it down a little bit, we have offshore transport. It's a relatively complex picture and makes one question how you could ever have a simple parametric model to explain that kind of process. The other thing we were able to do with this results was bring in my training as an oceanographer and look at something we call stratification. So stratification is typically refers to the division of the ocean into layers because of different densities. Now, usually that density changes come because of heat differences or quantity of salt, but there's no reason that sediment could induce stratification in it too. Oceanographers parameterize stratification using something known as the Richardson number. Richardson number needs not, if we're looking for that in terms of sediment, we need to know the concentration and the velocities, both things we had from the VIMA-FOBS combination. Oceanographers talk about a critical number as 0.25. When the Richardson number is above that, it's critically stratified, and then mixing, the transport of things from one layer to the other is impeded. Using the VIMA-FOBS data, we were able to show this is a plot of height above the bed versus time. The waves that we're seeing are represented in the upper image. And what we were able to show was that critical stratification was occurring in these boundary layers regularly. We were also able to point out that this was occurring essentially under the crest of the wave, and that it was obviously ephemeral. It would come and go. So what we have is this picture where under sediment transport on the crest of the waves, sediment and turbulence are being capped and maintained near the bed. Now remember what happens near the bed? Sediment is moved onshore. So the stratification is leading to a process where we're preferentially moving sediment onshore rather than offshore. To test out whether this was the case, it was a point in my career where we started to throw modeling into the picture. And I went to, my go-to model was a model called the Generalized Ocean Turbulence Model. It's a 1D model, so all it does is model what changes in the vertical. It doesn't really know about what happens to the left or the right. It was an open source code, which was somewhat rare in those days. And being an oceanography model, it was specialized in trying to determine, trying to look at problems of stratification. So it was the ideal model for me to use in this case. Just a quick idea of the kind of thing we were getting out of this. So we would get the vertical picture. It's a 1D model, so we have distribution above the bed of things occur, and then we run the model through time, and we get the behavior through time of stuff. So the color here represents levels. The top plot is showing us the fluid velocities above the bed. The bottom plot is showing us sediment concentration above the bed. And of course, the product of those two is giving us the sediment transport. Now, if we take this for a long period of time, 10 or 15 minutes, and average the transport signal that you get, we would get a picture like this. So the green line, no, the red line represents sediment transport predicted by Gotham under a wave field. The average transport, and we see the picture that we did before, offshore at the top, onshore at the bottom. But if we throw stratification into a picture, we change into the situation, we change the picture, and all of a sudden that offshore transport is reduced without largely affecting the onshore transport. And so that was a good confirming results. We did want to try and see, well, can we extend this? If we try and look at how a beach behaves because of this, can we show that it actually is an important process? And to do that, we referred back to the duck data, but duck data from an experiment 3 years later than the one I attended. My colleagues, Edie Gallagher and colleagues collected it's almost come as a reference case of beach behavior. They had a series of independent installations that measured both the change in the seabed as a function of time and also the fluid velocities in there. So we went in and we ran a series of Gotham models at every place where they had observations. We ran the model, we forced the model using those recorded velocities and simulated the sediment transport that was occurring. By then differencing the sediment transport occurring at those different stations, we could predict on average how the beach responded in those time periods. And we simulated several different events that they had measured. Long story short is we were able to show that the simulations were much better, including stratification into the picture than not. Another thing we discovered is we had some curiosity. I didn't mention this in the first time around here, but the model predictions don't exactly match the field predictions. We wondered what was on. We went back and looked at the sediment, the size that we were observed in the field, and realized we'd rounded down the grain size. It wasn't really 200 microns. It was 240 microns. And when we include the new grain size into the simulations, we were almost perfectly able to reproduce the observations. And this led us to be aware that we were being kind of sloppy about grain size effects in the flume. And not only were we sloppy because we used the wrong sediment, but we were treating everything as a single grain size. And so if you look at a picture of beach sand, you can see that they're not all the same grain size. They represent a range of sizes. In fact, if you look at a distribution of grain sizes, for example, from Pra sands in Cornwall, you get a plot like this. So this is the grain size and the percentage of the sand that is composed of sediments of that size or smaller. We decided that maybe we need to start including the fact that the beds are composed of this range of sizes. And Dan Buscombe, who was my first postdoc when I was at Plymouth, and I got together and we recovered all the field data that had previously been done looking at this kind of process. Traditionally, it's handled by something called a hiding function. So as sediments are in suspension, they largely respond as they would on their own, even if there are other sediments along. But when they're in the bed, it actually has a dramatic effect on the mobilization of the sediments. Large grains tend to be mobilized earlier if they have smaller grains underneath them. Small grains tend to be mobilized later if they have big grains surrounding them. And that's captured in a parameter called the hiding function. And so we came up with a new model for the hiding function. We implemented it on the GATA model. We went out to the experiment. We tried to do some simulations where this beach sand was collected, and we modeled the size distribution of the sediments we expect to be in suspension above the bed, about 10 centimeters above the bed. And our model results are this straight line up, this solid line up here. Now, we actually had some independent measurements of that suspended sediment concentration, and it was this dashed line over here. So they're not a perfect fit. But if you consider the traditional assumption has been that your bed concentrations are what are suspended, we're clearly doing a much better job of being able to predict what happens into the ocean. Okay, and that kind of leads us on to active research that we're working on right now. We've been doing some observations out in the Isles of Scilly in the seagrass beds, probably the healthiest seagrass bed in the UK. And we were looking at the grain sizes of sediments that are in these bare patches of sand and the grain sizes that are in the seagrass. And we found that there's a dramatic difference. Those bare patches are significantly coarser than the sediments in the seagrass. And that's not just true from out here in the open to down here in the patch, but it's actually true in that little pocket of sediment between two different seagrass patches around it. So this seemed like an optimal location to be able to test out our ability not only to simulate the behavior of sediment grain size distributions, collections of different sizes, but also our ability to begin to simulate the interactions between the biological world and the physical world. What is that interaction? Well, here's a snapshot of seagrass under waves and currents. And you see the seagrass is up and it's bent way over, following the wave flow as it goes off to the left. But a couple seconds later, that wave's going to change direction and it's going to move off to the right. Now, when the seagrass is bent out like that and extended out fully, it's no longer moving, and the waves are moving. So there's friction between those two, and that friction tends to generate turbulence, and turbulence is a critical parameter for sediment response. So we've got a new source of turbulence there. But as all of a sudden it starts floating back and flopping back until it gets to its full extent in the other direction, there is no shear. There's no difference between the fluid and the plant motions itself, and the turbulence generation turns off. So we've got this great picture where we have a phase-sensitive generation of turbulence in the flow. We have a phase-sensitive response of sediments in the bed, and that's a process that's designed to lead to results that would be very hard to predict. Fortunately, GOTM does have a Seagrass module, which very much tries to simulate this process. We now have our sediment response model in there, and we are able to run some simulations. And this just shows you on the computer what that Seagrass process looks like. You can see there are these end states where there is a difference in velocity between the fluid and the plant, and turbulence is being generated, but there's intermediate states where the seagrass is passively flying around and it doesn't affect the flow hardly whatsoever. Much as we did on the duck data, we then tried to use pairs of these GOTM models to see if we could get an idea of what would behave. And so to simulate what happens in a seagrass patch as the waves are entering seagrass, we got the sediment grain sizes from the bare sands. We ran a simulation with including vegetation, seagrass in red, and a simulation without the seagrass in blue. And then we plotted the transport components for each different size of sediment that we looked at. In this case, and we can spend hours talking about this, but if the red is greater than the blue, that means that sediment grains are entering the seagrass patch from the bare sands. And what we see is fine grains are entering the seagrass, but the coarse sands are being deposited and staying behind. We can repeat this process also for the other edge of the patch, where we put a simulation using the seagrass size distributions. We run two models again. But in this case, because we're leaving the patch, if blue is greater than red, then grains are leaving the patch. But here we've got red, bare, and blue. That means fine grains are being deposited in the patch, and coarse grains are being preferentially stripped out of the seagrass bed. So this process is clearly going to lead to the similar type to the observations that we observed before. And we feel that we've got a great tool not only to investigate these processes more, but other questions about, like perhaps how much protection does seagrass provide to coastlines, how are nutrients fed into seagrass beds, and other questions. I'm late there, so I'm going to run through this. I did promise in the flyer, I did promise you all a round the world tour of the world's oceans, and I'm going to put that into the context. The other underlying theme of my life's work actually is installing instruments into the ocean and making measurements, and that actually started before the PhD. I worked for a company called Schlumberger, who make measurements. They make measurements in oil wells around the world, but I worked in the offshore department. And in addition to providing me a really exciting and interesting life flying on helicopters and so on for a young person out of college, it gave me a lasting education in all kinds of measurement theory, understanding sensor principles of operation, calibration, interpretation of data, and possibly most importantly, troubleshooting, which is a skill I still use quite a bit this day. This went on at Scripps, and Scripps was a case where I was fortunate enough to get to an institution that provided me incredible opportunities. The opportunity I was most appreciative of was the Scripps Pier, which jutted out into the Pacific Ocean, and from which I could dangle off instruments and drop them down to the bottom of the sea, which made the installation of instruments much easier. The duck experiment, this is a picture of the Vima fobs to give you an idea of the instruments that I got to use, but what an incredible facility. There's all kinds of strange objects there that you never aware of. This is a duck, an amphibious vehicle that the Corps had access to. This vehicle drive up to the beach. We could put our instruments on board. We can put up any supplies, turn it around, head out into the surf zone, and drop them off and drop off divers and whatever else onto the sea. The Crab was a 10-meter tall tower, which could drive out to sea and back. And using a theodolite on the top, we could get beach profiles out to 10 meters depth in almost any kind of oceanic conditions. Moving on back to NERC, they gave me a lot of opportunities there. The research that I got to do with Rob Holman was possibly most interesting, was the use of the unmanned aerial vehicles that had told us about. This is actually something that my colleagues do almost on a weekly basis now here in the US, partly, not in the US, at Plymouth, making mosaics, actually even measuring topography using UAVs. This is, however, a little bit different than a mosaic. This is actually a time-lapse video image. So this is something that nearshore process people do regularly using land-based fixed video cameras. This is possibly the only image I know of a time average video coming from airborne vehicles. And finally, coming to Plymouth, continued to add to it. In the first experiment I did here out on Pra Sands, my colleague, Alex Nemo Smith, allowed us to use a Holocam, which was this amazing instrument designed to take holographic pictures of a volume of the ocean. It was used a lot for looking at plankton studies, but Alex gave it to us and encouraged us to use it to try and study sediments in suspension in the swash. And by focusing these holographic cameras through different slices in time, we could identify whether something was a sand grain, whether it was a diatom chain, whether it was an air bubble. And using those measurements, not only could we get the concentration of sediments in suspension, but we could actually get the size distribution, which was a unique opportunity. And finally, as I got older, I still like field work, but I don't quite have the energy that I used to. And so I decided that this might be a good opportunity to go into the remote sensing sector. And we've set up the UK's only existing 2-station hot film radar station, which is designed to make remote observations of ocean conditions based on land-based sensors. We can measure waves, we can measure surface currents and waves over a large section of ocean. I don't know if I'm going to get this to work. Probably going to go on to the next slide. Anyways, it's supposed to give us a time series of the currents off of hail, and you can see the tidal currents flowing back and forth. And there's all kinds of ways to apply that, but it gives you a quick idea of, gives you my tour of the ocean and a quick idea of some of the measurements I've done. I do want to take a little bit of time to make some acknowledgements. I was originally going to put a huge list on there. And I decided I would leave out more people that I didn't want to than I would just. So I'm going to do a couple key people. I do want to acknowledge my parents, my mother, Hope, who taught me the love of the ocean and particularly love of the beaches. And my father, who gave me a curiosity about science. I do feel immensely fortunate and perhaps privileged to have been able to combine both those interests in my career through my lifetime, which is something I appreciate. I was recently thinking about the fact that I'd almost forgotten this, but unfortunately, we don't seem to realize when we've achieved our dreams. One of those trips to the ocean that my mother took me out was to San Diego. And one day we were up at La Jolla Shores, and my sister were playing in the ocean for 10 hours straight. We didn't get out for lunch. We were just having such a good time. And our towels were placed right underneath this sign. And so at the end of the day, when I went back up there and sat there, I turned around and I saw that sign. I said, Scripps Institution of Oceanography, what is this? And my mother said, oh, it's a university. They study the ocean here. And I told her, I said, I'm gonna study here someday. And I totally forgot that incident until I was about 5 years into my PhD, but I wanted to get a picture of when I got back there. The other person is my advisor, my PhD supervisor, Doug Inman. Obviously, I thank him because he introduced me to the field and he introduced me to a community of brilliant people who were studying it. But I'm also very appreciative and cognizant, being in the same role today, that he really took a chance on a 25-year-old person who had just spent 3 years taking a 3-year gap year and gave me the opportunity, which not a lot of other people were doing at that time. So I owe him a great, the whole team, the CPRG team at Plymouth is the answer to Hed's question, why I'm here. I appreciate them all, but biggest shout out I want to say is the technical staff around the world. The work we do can't be done without them. We are immensely lucky to have Peter Ganderton as our chief technical engineer for the CPRG, and all the other people who work for him have been a big contribution to success in the world. So this is by no means the sunset of my career, but you've all been sitting in here patiently for a while. There are some drinks and things to sit out there in the hall. So it is time for me to stop talking and see if you have any questions.
Thank you, Daniel. Very, very interesting. And thanks for including my research of 25 years ago. And it was at DUC, not Australia. I've got some questions on Slido. One question in particular has been voted up quite a lot, which I'm going to read out. What has been the most useful experience in your career? What advice would you give a young person just starting out?
The most useful experience. Well, I probably didn't realize it until I presented this talk, but frankly, that training I got at Schlumberger was actually something that everybody else most other people have to learn from experience. To have a formal education in measurement, in doing what you like to do, is actually a gift, at least for me. My advice to young people would be probably two different things. One is choose something you're interested in. It's really far more important in what you do in life than any other factor. So do follow your dreams. And but the other thing I would say, particularly if you're going into academia, is to embrace change. You heard from my biography, I've had a fair amount of change in it. After my mother taught me the love of the ocean and everything, I abandoned her and left her alone for the last 20 years of her life back in America. And I do have regrets about that. That's why I wanted to share the evening with her. But the change and the different experiences I've had have definitely had a huge contribution to who I am. And I think it's important for most people.
I've got a question of someone, I think it's a job interview question. Assume you've been given an open budget and unlimited time. Where would your research take you? And is this a personal choice, or do you feel that your research ought to be important or relevant to society? It's a two-part question.
I could go off on a long rant there for the second half of that question. And I'm going to try and control myself, but I do believe research should be relevant to society. But actually, I'm aware of very little research which is not relevant for society. What I am a little bit concerned about our current state of affairs is we have a world. When I started my career, I was at the end of an era where governments believed in funding research scientists to develop fundamental new knowledge. Corporations had research departments to take the fundamental knowledge which was coming out of universities and develop products that they could make money off of. In our modern world, this is probably not the answer the person wants. In our modern world, fundamental research has disappeared. The government is paying university scientists to perform applied research, and the corporations are taking the applied research and making the money off of it. That may be all fine and good, but it does leave me wondering where our fundamental knowledge gap is going to come from in the future, which I think is an issue that people should think about. It's not all doom and gloom. I'm happy to see plenty of students and so on in the room, and I believe attending online. The other part of this deal was not only did the scientists do the fundamental research in the university, they also instructed the young, and that's a part of the deal we're still certainly hanging on to. So I think there's a positive side to that, to way to spin on that. I think that there are all kinds of, as the last slide showed, I think there are all kinds of topics related to the interactions of physics and biology, and I see people coming from this from different things, which is probably where I would be interested in focusing that money that you just gave me.
Okay, I've got an applied question here. Yeah. I think most of us in the Southwest are familiar with the Dawlish Railway and the potential threat to it due to sea level rise and disappearing beaches. This is a sub-question here is, what research needs doing to determine the future movement of sediment along the coastal section of the railway between Plymouth and Dawlish? And will beaches really disappear, or will new ones form as sea level rises?
I'm not sure I'll answer all of that question. I'm not 100% sure. I spent a lot of the talk talking about how models don't work, but that's actually not a complete description. The models are fairly good at getting general concepts right if they're properly applied and they're properly ground truth with field measurements. And I'm not sure we don't know that much. We don't know enough about the sediment pathways and so on in that location. I believe that if you build a solid wall and you raise sea level, yes, the beaches will disappear and you will have nothing but walls behind them. If, however, you can make accommodation space and you can make these wave processes that want to move sediment onshore, you give them the room to do their work, beaches will survive and continue, although they may be displaced in location.
Okay, another one to maybe talk a little bit about offshore renewable energy. It's a question on scour. How does your sediment transport knowledge and modeling capabilities inform scour?
Yeah, so a good question. And half of my answer is that a lot of the scour that we observe, particularly in shallow locations like where most of our wind farms are currently, some of the scour comes from tidal currents. The wave-driven knowledge that I've developed is not so important under those conditions. But did I say that correctly? The current-driven transport is not scour, is not informed that much by my research. But in the shallow locations, the wave-driven scour is equally as important as the mean currents, and so everything we've talked about applies. However, I would have to say that the processes I talk about are probably important in what we call nonlinear waves. So as waves go from being a nice approximation of a sinusoid to something with big peaks and broad troughs, and that's when those processes really come into play. Usually when you're talking about 10 or tens of meters, the waves don't have that form, and so they're not so critical.
Okay, one on nature-based solutions involving seagrasses. So how can your research help inform seagrass restoration projects, and how can they benefit coastlines?
So if, there's a couple of questions there. One couple answers there. One is, if properly funded, we can document very well exactly what the protective capabilities of seagrass are. We can in several different ways. But another more direct response that we're working on right now is to try and beginning to understand what the physical characteristics of seagrass plants are, and being able to determine where the hydrodynamic conditions are too intense for them to survive. So this gives you a way of determining where you might want to reintroduce seagrass, where you might want to plant it and use it as a nature-based solution, and conditions that are totally inappropriate for it. This is obviously already done to some degree, but it's most of the focus is on sort of, I'm going to use the wrong word, but nutritional life cycle components, nutrition, light penetration, et cetera. I think that if we look at where seagrass exists and where it doesn't, it tells me we need to spend a lot more time thinking about the physical forcing on them.
Got a nice easy one now. Why are there beaches at some places and not at others?
Yeah, well, we're hitting on all kinds of topics that I used to believe were important, but it's the geologic setting, I think, in most cases. Two issues. One thing is the geologic setting. If you have a flat vertical cliff, it's pretty hard to build a seawall, a beach there. There's all. It's a little bit like the breakwaters I talked about. If you've got a fixed boundary, it's really hard for a beach to develop. And the other is a lack of sediment supply. If you have an environment that's sediment starved, it's also hard to maintain and keep a beach.
You're racing through these, Daniel. Very good. I've got a challenging here is how good are we at morphodynamic modeling along coastlines? And I assume what's meant over short as well as long time scales.
Yeah. How good are we? I think a fair question is, are we as good at predicting beaches as we are at predicting the weather? And I know everybody has an opinion about that. Unfortunately, I think the answer is probably not. But there's useful information to be gotten from not being able to predict tomorrow's weather, but to predict the climate. And I think that current models are fairly good at being able to predict the morphological climate, if you want, at least on the short term. Doing that for a long term is still a challenge, but there are a lot of different techniques that are being tried, and I don't think we're far away from being able to do that, at least on a climatological basis.
Well, a quick one here. What's your favorite beach and why? Local beach.
Favorite local beach. I like Whitsand Bay because it's close by and it's big and long, like some of the beaches I was used to in California.
Okay, one more. I think we have time for one more, which is this university is sort of injecting a bit of momentum into developing autonomous capability for monitoring. Do you think autonomous monitoring and measurements will ever replace field measurements?
And where did that come from?
Just made it up.
Yeah. For people, and probably many in the room have, for people who swum in the surf zone or tried to put out instruments or measure stuff out there, particularly under big waves, I think we've got a long time to go before autonomous vehicles are going to be working in the surf zone. But on the other hand, in the recent field experiment we did at Isles of Scilly to look at seagrass, we did acoustic. Our colleague Tim Scott used autonomous vehicles to do depth surveys in seagrass beds, and the precision and control that the vehicles were able to take was probably the biggest contribution to that. We got great results, really wonderful results. So it's certainly encroaching on there, but I think the surf zone's safe for a while. Okay, I'm really worried what other questions behind the corner there. I think you are all thirsty, so I think we're going to take this chance. I totally missed getting my slide, didn't I? I think we're going to take this chance for thanking you once again for joining us, and I hope you will join us for a drink outside. And thank you, everybody out in the ether. We appreciate your presence here. I hope you had a good evening, worthwhile evening.